Hi everyone, in this lecture I'll be going over using research for termination and more specifically what the research says about termination in mental health treatment. First, we'll go over some reasons for ethical termination, basically good reasons for terminating. First, the client has met their treatment goals. This is the ideal situation. This means that the goals that you've established at the beginning of therapy have been met by the client and they are no longer needing therapy at this moment. The second ethical reason for termination has to do with the client no longer paying their fees. Now, this is different from if you were providing pro bono services and now you've just changed your mind and you don't want to provide them anymore. That's completely different. This is if you are charging a fee and for whatever reason, the client is no longer paying that fee. So there are steps that you would follow in this case, and you'll learn more about those in law and ethics, but basically, you would discuss the issue with the client, maybe lower your fee or develop a payment plan for the client. But then if ultimately they were just not paying anymore and nothing was working, you would go ahead and stop providing services. Next, if the client is no longer benefiting from treatment, so you're doing things in therapy, the client's not making any progress, maybe is not really actively participating in therapy, and you've discussed it with your client, you've discussed it with your supervisor, maybe you've tried different approaches, and it still doesn't seem to be working, then this probably means you need to refer them to someone else and you would terminate. Next, if you, the therapist, are physically or emotionally unable to continue, so physically, perhaps you're really sick and you can't provide services anymore, or emotionally, maybe something you're dealing with the client is triggering something for you that you're not able to process, or you're having your own mental health issues, and continuing to serve the client could potentially be harmful, then you would want to go ahead and terminate. And then finally, if an ethical conflict or conflict of interest develops or you're made aware of it, you would discuss this with your client, with your supervisor, and in most cases, terminate. There are also some situations that it would be inappropriate to terminate. The first is if the client is experiencing a crisis. So for example, they're actively suicidal or they just experienced a significant loss, something like that. So in this case, even if they have met their treatment goals and you had already started terminating, but then this crisis happens, you would not want to terminate until it's resolved. Another inappropriate reason to terminate is because you want to have a different kind of relationship with the client, like maybe you're attracted to the client and you want to pursue some kind of romantic relationship. That is 100% inappropriate. You should terminate with the client most likely if you can't keep those feelings in check, but that doesn't mean that now that you've terminated with them, you can have a relationship with them. That's not okay. And then finally, client abandonment, like you just stop seeing them, and that's not good. And is highly unethical. Okay, so let's talk about therapeutic change. So therapeutic change typically will result from a growth within the client, which leads to a more developmentally normal level of functioning. And this is what we seek out when we're working with clients. However, even when this happens, some aspects of our clients' problems will persist beyond therapy. And these are the things that we need to work on with them in order to prepare them to be successful once we terminate. We basically want to set them up for success when we're no longer in the picture. Now, there are some things that may arise during the termination process. One is a fear of facing problems alone, and maybe a fear of burdening their other people with their problems, whereas they pay you to burden you with their problems. They may feel uncomfortable with doing so with other people. And in this case, it helps when we connect them to existing support networks, professional assistance, and we help them to build their social supports outside of us. Partial change, so some of their problematic experiences maybe have only partially changed post-therapy. We see this a lot with children and teens, for example. They're having to go back to their difficult homes or neglectful parents or whatever. And so that situation isn't necessarily going to change, but they perhaps have developed coping skills and things like that to help them be more successful. So in that case, we're having to prepare them for going back into that environment or for remaining in that environment and still being able to be successful. And then finally, we also need to prepare our clients for knowing that change is not linear and change will continue to be a process post-therapy. Just like they had ups and downs in the therapeutic relationship, this is going to continue as they experience different things in life. And we need to help them to be ready to activate their coping skills, activate their social supports when they encounter issues in their lives, or potentially to have booster sessions with you, their therapist, so that they don't relapse, right? But we want to normalize this process for them. Okay, now there are a number of reasons why therapy may terminate prematurely. The research that you read for this week's class identified intrapunitive hostility as one of the primary reasons why caregivers prematurely end therapy for their children, for example. This is hostility that includes self-criticism and delusional guilt, and it's distinguished from extrapunitive hostility, which involves an urge to act out of hostility, criticism of others, and projected or delusional hostility. So we can address this by identifying this personality style at the onset of therapy and paying attention or paying extra attention to the therapeutic alliance with the caregiver and with the client. Another issue might be problems of fit between the client and the therapist, and this arises from inadequate joining, poor empathy, and just not enough attention to building that relationship, just assuming that it's going to happen naturally. Another issue that may contribute to problems of fit is the therapist not having confidence in their own abilities. So to address this, we want to practice active listening, empathy, joining activities, processing that imposter syndrome with your therapist or your supervisor, and checking in regularly on the relationship, on the therapeutic relationship. Clients may also struggle with not being adequately prepared for the fact that things often get worse before they get better. So things as they get better, so if things start to get worse in therapy, they may think, oh, this isn't working, I need to stop, right? But we want to prepare clients instead that this is a normal part of therapy. We want to add extra supports when things are challenging, link them to a social support group, for example, and normalize this experience. Let them know that yes, things may get worse, but they will get better. And this is especially true when we're addressing behavioral problems in children, for example. Another issue is dissatisfaction with services. This may be due to your inefficacy as a therapist and you're still learning and you're having to kind of figure out how to deal with things, and that's okay. But it may also be due to the client's own resistance to change. You may be doing everything right, but this is triggering the client because they're not ready to change. And that's something to confront in therapy. The last two are fairly straightforward. The client doesn't have time or interest in continuing, so they just want to stop. And then finances may be an issue where they want to continue therapy, but they simply can't afford it any longer. How can we support treatment compliance? Well, although we can never guarantee that a client will remain in therapy until their goals are met, there are things that we can do to help support treatment compliance and ultimately ethical termination. We want to start by monitoring and being responsive to the client's needs. And this involves openly discussing the progress of therapy in session. So their likes, their dislikes, their needs, their wants. It also involves monitoring outcomes regularly to illustrate where progress is being made, as well as potential reasons for stunted progress. We want to prioritize the client's experience and expectations, which brings us back to the importance of collaborative goals so that they feel invested in the process. We can also support compliance by creating and maintaining safety. Part of this is developing that strong alliance early in treatment and maintaining it throughout. It also involves developing this relationship before diving into complex or difficult issues and helping the client to develop adaptive coping skills prior to engaging in trauma work or in other discussions that may be triggering. Finally, remember to debrief sessions, especially those of a difficult nature, at the end of every session. We can also support treatment compliance by providing education regarding the common advances and setbacks of therapy from the very beginning. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it can help the clients to know that it's normal to feel worse before they feel better, and for children's behaviors to get worse before they get better, and that this is part of the process. This can help clients from becoming discouraged or thinking that therapy is not working. Finally, we want to create and facilitate linkage. You don't want the client to become dependent on you to the point that when therapy ends, they have no one. So we want to help connect them to social supports. We want to engage them in activity scheduling, exposure tasks, and behavioral experiences and experiments to help them to connect or reconnect with others and develop helpful habits. So finally, how can we support ethical termination? We want to begin with the intention of ending. This may sound silly, but you want to remember that your goal is for your client no longer to need you. Now, of course, there are clients that have chronic mental health issues and will probably be in therapy for a very long time. But in general, we want our clients to be able to go on with their lives and use the skills they've learned in therapy without us. So we should make it clear at the very beginning that this is not a forever type of relationship. Termination should be discussed in the informed consent document. And this should also include the very real possibility that as a trainee, if their work is not done when your contract has ended, this will mean transferring to a new therapist, and you want them to be aware of that. Next, you want to develop clear goals and a collaborative understanding of what it will look like when the client's ready for termination. So clear, measurable goals that will tell you, okay, goals are met, we can start termination. And what will it look like when you're ready to end therapy? From the very beginning, establishing that, making a note of it, and revisiting it regularly, having these ongoing discussions about progress and termination. We also want to notice as therapists when it's time to enter the termination phase. We don't want to hang on to clients just because we like them or just because they're paying us a lot, right? So if the client has met their goals, you need to notice that as the therapist and be ready to end with them, okay? Finally, we want to treat termination as a process. It isn't something that should happen from one session to the next. Doing that may make the client feel like you're abandoning them, and that's not okay. So during the termination phase, we want to reflect on the progress the client has made and develop a plan for continued growth independently. We want to process any uncomfortable or negative emotions that might arise, like grief, anxiety, sadness, normalize those feelings, okay? And be open about discussing them in the termination phase. If necessary, we want to provide linkage to outside sources. And then we want to, with children in particular, but I would say with everyone, we want to have some kind of a termination activity to memorialize the experience and serve as a reminder of the progress that has been made. And there's lots of different activities you could engage in for termination. Okay? So that is it. Consult the readings for this week. We'll discuss some more in class and we'll discuss some actual termination activities. But let me know if you have questions, and thank you for listening.